Parallel, A Story of Two Universes, by By-WalterTheGermanyBall. Chapter 1, Unknown. Have you ever wondered where all that surrounds us came from? The plants, animals, and objects that make up our world must give you some sort of terror. Terror which stems from your lack of knowledge on their origins. We must know everything. We must understand everything. We cannot be content with ambiguity, because it scares us. But are you one of us? Do you fear this just as well? Or are you apathetic and disaffected by it? In such a case, you're truly unique, I must say. All others I've met are infatuated with such questions and mysteries, to the point that it dictates the rules by which they lead their lives. It's called faith, and it's the only thing that makes the pain and fear subside. It works for most of us, and it's one of the things that sets us apart from other animals. But it seems not to have truly grasped you yet. Am I correct? The pale old man, smothered in black religious garments, had finally finished speaking, for now at least. I continued to look toward the ground. I didn't care for a word of what he was saying, and he knew that just as well as I. That's what he does. That's what they all do. They don't care if you're interested. They don't care if the nonsense they're spewing will really help you. They just want to continue to jam the same old phrases down your throat. And though that may have gotten most people to blindly follow them, I'm not so easily convinced. Yes, it doesn't interest me, and I see no reason why it should. I finally responded, just so he'd stop giving me that impatient glare. He waited for a few moments to gather his thoughts, probably preparing to regurgitate the propaganda I had already heard 1,000,000 times over. Do you know why your mother gave you that name? My head slowly tilted upward to face him. He knows better than to mention her without a reason, so I indulged him a bit. I'm not exactly sure. Something to do with whatever she believed. He nodded and replied cautiously, so as not to anger me. Yes, that's correct. She believed that anyone with that name would be able to get us out of all this misery. So she gave it to you, because she believed you would live up to that legacy. But now she's foregone any semblance of hope for you and your faith, Hælend, and I have to be the one to strip you of your name entirely. I shook my head and gathered the courage to say all that which I had been thinking. Go ahead. Take it. I know I won't heal us all. That was nonsense from the beginning. You're all without any true knowledge of the world. You've all just retired to your bubble of belief, blocking out any fact. I'm so sick and tired of having to follow these malicious lies, because I know that even if I can't heal the world by whatever insane means you've all been hoping for, breaking out of this place and actually trying to be part of the world will be a whole hell of a lot more helpful. He sighed and began to give me a new glare, this one much angrier, and though that would normally scare me off and make me shut up, I had to keep going this time. You ask me if what surrounds me perplexes and fascinates me as much as it does you and all your followers, but the truth is that I know where it all came from. You may not have created it, but you've placed all of these people and things around in the exact order you wanted, in the exact order that pleases you most. You acted like a god to plan out this entire area, but I've seen the outside, and I know that it's all a pre-made lie, and I won't rest until every poor person here, the fear of which you've exploited for your own fantasy, sees the outside too. After this, he finally broke through his friendly facade. Enough! I have heard enough of these ridiculous fantasies. What we tell you is based on all that we have seen over thousands of years, while you merely spout claims of visions that cannot be proven. I don't want to hear any more of this, so I think we'll take you away and sort this out in a more decisive way. He slowly stood up and made a fist while coming toward me. I knew exactly what was about to happen, so I backed away from him more and more urgently. I made it to the door of this dim, depressing office and attempted to open it up, but to no avail. Did you really think I didn't anticipate this, Hælend? I know you're delusional, and if I wish to now appease the overseer with my honesty, your mother didn't really tell me to strip you of your name. She told me to do whatever it takes to fix your insanity. He rushed toward me and grasped me as I attempted to get out through the window. I struggled desperately to escape his strong, charred hands and prevent them from knocking me unconscious, but I couldn't. He managed to hit me right in the head, knocking me to the floor, and the last thing I saw as my vision faded was that sadistic creep laughing at my misery. I knew that I wouldn't get out of this place easily, but for the sake of the parallel, I had to stop them all. Chapter 2. Cult. I woke up in a somehow more depressing, damp room. It reminded me directly of the despair I had been shown by my visions. Maybe that was their intention, to build a holding cell resembling the most horrific possible future. Two of them stood right over me and laughed, with one of them muttering through their mask. "Look who's awake. What took you so long? Having another one of those visions?" They both looked at each other, then at me while laughing hysterically. The other then began to speak. "Don't worry. We're going to make sure you stop having those." He walked over and grabbed some sort of white stick. I couldn't exactly make out what it was due to my continuing blurry vision, but I knew it was going to hurt like hell. He got a really strong grip on it before bringing it down like a hammer on my abdomen. I don't have any idea what they did to it, but it made my body sting as if it were on fire. I cried out in pain. "Why are you doing this to me?" I screamed out right as the other was about to bash another one of those things against my chest. They paused, and the one to my left kneeled down and began talking to me in a very patronizing tone. "Well, you see, we do this a lot. It's often much worse than what you're about to experience because, hopefully, we can knock this right out of you on the first go. I mean, where do you think we got these?" He held the weapon out toward me, and I could see more clearly what it was. I jolted back into the wall as he got on all fours like an animal and crawled toward me. The other stood there, with his face constantly moving around in a rabid fashion, showing that he clearly found this pleasurable. I knew this place was an abomination, but I thought I had seen the worst of it. The way my mother treated me, the way the leaders treated me, the restriction bestowed upon me felt like punishment enough for being born in this hellhole, but I had no idea it could get this bad. He started going faster and faster until he was right up against me, and he spoke his twisted, sadistic words directly into my ear with his chilling tone. Normally, whatever these freaks would say to me would go right out the other ear, but this time it permeated all throughout my body and soul, because I knew that this lunatic could and would do anything to me. "We're just going to do this real quick, and then hopefully you'll never have to be in here again. A shame, really, but I suppose there are enough other sinners for me to handle." He stood up and brought his weapon down on me once again. This time it hurt even more because he landed it right on my chest. He continued to beat me with it before taking a brief pause to gesture to his partner. Then they both started wailing on me constantly. Sometimes I'd get lucky and they'd hit a less sensitive area, but as it went on, they seemed to actively seek out the spots where it would hurt the most. I could feel them nearly breaking my ribs as I screamed in agony. They kept yelling that I should be quiet as if they wouldn't make a sound when in such misery. The suffering I felt grasped my entire body and wouldn't let go for a second. At the start, it would become more comfortable whenever they stopped hitting me, but now that my body had bruised and wounds had been created all over me, there wasn't a single moment during which I felt relief. I didn't know if they'd ever stop. Maybe they would once I was about to finally die, but in such a case they'd just wait a while until they could keep going. They'd continue to beat me and wouldn't even grant me the sweet release of death. I didn't know what I had done to deserve this, what anyone could ever do to deserve this. I bathed in a puddle of my own blood, and for what? Having visions of a better life? Having something that shows the invalidity of this whole place and everyone in its blind following? All right, Now do you see? The beating finally ended, and I heard that creep bellow some twisted question that no one could feasibly answer. Yet another one of their many tricks. What? I managed to break through the pain to let out a quiet whisper of a question. You heard me. Are you seeing the underworld's hallucinations anymore? I slowly opened up my eyes and looked directly into his. I see the light. I see the faces of my brothers in this world. I see nothing but the true beauty of the Overseer's glorious creations. Even the blood that flows from my broken body reflects the light that he himself gave us. I am no longer in the nightmare of the underworld, and I realize what is true and good in this world. I knew that unless I gave a good performance, I'd be beaten for the rest of my days. Unless I could make them believe that the visions had stopped, they'd always see me as a crazed lunatic taken over by the devil. These freaks would, but the rest of the Overseer's followers would never want to see an innocent one of them beaten half to death. However, if portrayed as an emissary of all that is evil in the world, I become the true enemy of them all. Really? You must be so overjoyed, said the less sadistic one to my right, who seemed to buy it. Unfortunately, the creep on my left wasn't so convinced. If such a statement should be held as truth in the eyes of the Overseer, I should be able to incapacitate you without any behavior proceeding during your sleep. Correct? The bastard had caught on. He knew exactly what to do. The things I say in my sleep are almost entirely uncontrollable. The actions I commit even less so, meaning he'll most certainly be able to uncover my deceit. Yes, that's true. However, I often say and do things in my sleep without having a vision, I swear. They're not totally connected. He smirked. You really think I'd believe that when the things you do are so obviously influenced by the underworld? There is no earthly way that such a connection is not persistent through all of your incapacitated doings. It feels almost as if you're trying to get out of sleeping. No, I swear, I merely wanted to make that clear. If I do not directly mention such things that the underworld would want me to speak of, then I should not be considered an emissary of it. He nodded slowly while taking something out of his pocket. That sounds fair. Well then, let's hope that you're all better. I could now see what he was holding, a vial. This was never a desirable sight, as the things that they could put inside of those vials could do nearly anything. I hope it will only make me sleep. However, there's no telling what additional effects it could have on my body. He could even theoretically plant the seeds of heretical speech within my mind so as to create evidence of visions, and I wouldn't put that past him, considering how much he seemed to enjoy his first torture session with me. He jammed the needle of the vial right into my leg. It hurt like hell. He shot it right into my bloodstream, taking me out quite quickly. Sweet dreams, he said, once again speaking directly into my ear. I could strangely feel a moment of pure darkness before I opened my eyes, almost as if I could perceive time while I was asleep. Once I awakened, however, I was back in a familiar place, one which I, in all honesty, miss more than anything else, the parallel plane. Chapter 3. Vision. I woke up in a truly beautiful place, surrounded by the warmth of escapism, no longer trapped within the despair-inducing pit that is the compound. I was free within this strange tether. Since I was young, I had, in some way or another, been connected to this place. I don't know how real this all is, but it feels like such a vital aspect of my life that's been around for so long that I doubt none of it's actually happening. I gazed upon a truly magnificent sight, a massive field of seemingly infinite size with blades of grass in every color imaginable poking through the ground and shards of glass floating peacefully in the air, becoming more closely connected as they near the parallel itself, almost like atoms becoming more solid. And there it stood, the parallel, a hauntingly beautiful sight to behold, which decided all of the rules of our world and the other, but that seemed precariously suspended in between them itself. I had been learning about it from the very beginning of my life, yet there was still lots to understand. Life itself is not a concept that can be easily comprehended. "I see you're not doing too well." A familiar voice crept up behind me, like music to my ears in this time of true despair and misery. "Keeper, you have no idea how glad I am to see you." I ran up and embraced the only person who I felt really understood me, the Keeper. Though I had connections, friends, and family back in the compound, almost nobody believed me about these visions. Nobody had stuck with me from the start of my life to this massive low point, except for him. The Keeper has kept the parallel intact for practically all of eternity, and he's had to deal with many threats which wish to destroy it. Ever since I was young, he stressed how vital it was to our world that the parallel never be broken or damaged, lest a fracture will begin, causing total, unbridled chaos. I knew due to his reasonable demeanor that this was someone who I should trust, especially since the pain which my captors believed to be caused by the parallel doesn't seem to have any true connection to it, though I can understand this mistake, as they've no concept of it beyond a vague idea spawned out of emotions, and that same fear which they so desperately want to instill in me. "I know that this is a very tough point, but I believe that the most important part of your journey is still yet to come. You know I can only communicate with you in your sleep, so I'm afraid we cannot talk any more after this vision, Hælend. You remember your training. You've been preparing to stop them your whole life. This is the most important threat I have seen in over 1,000 years, and I know you're the only one with enough knowledge and power of these people to stop them. It won't be easy, but you need to get the hell out of there and find a way to bring them down, by whatever means necessary." I let go of him and sat down between the beautiful grass patches around me. "I'm fully prepared to do that. I will save the parallel no matter what. I will not let you down, I promise." He smiled and began to slowly fade into a void. I could begin to feel the pain again, and I no longer saw the beautiful sights of the parallel plane. I wish I could stay there forever, but alas, if we always stayed at our highest, we would never be able to confront the demons of our lowest. "I knew you lied!" That sadistic monster began to laugh in my face as I woke back up, now stranded in the real world with no more visions to secure the journey ahead of me. The two creeps picked me up and began dragging me across the floor towards the door, but my body was so weakened from that beating that I collapsed in spite of their grasp. "Sometimes I wonder how the Overseer could approve such runts," said the one to my right, still with some humanity in his voice. Then the animal had to open his muzzle. "It's a blessing, though, my friend. It gives us something nice to hack away at, something to take out the pain of perfection on." He continued to laugh like a hyena gazing upon the most vulnerable prey imaginable. "Well, I think it's time we go see Mommy, eh?" My heart sank. I may have said that very few people here understand me, but my mother actually does, just in a twisted way. She herself has had visions since a young age, just like me. However, they've been very different and have motivated very different actions as well. She terrifies me even more than these rabid dogs because she can gaze right through me. She sees a version of herself corrupted by the underworld within me, and she thinks I can still be saved. But the truth is, the only ones who need to be saved are her potential victims, and the only one who can save them is me. Chapter 4. Mother. They forcefully dragged me across the compound, all the people that I had seen, both those who hated me more than anything, and those who cared about me immensely, the few of them, who were completely mortified at the sight. I heard gasps, saw jaws hanging open, and felt a wide range of emotions. From satisfaction to surprise to pure terror, it seems everyone felt something completely different about the situation. But I really only felt fear, nothing else. They finally got to my family's hut, the place in which I grew up, the place in which I have made a large number of my memories, is also a place that at this point I least wanted to be near. I guess sometimes we just need to get away from our past, even if we loved where we were at the time. They slid the curtains to the side with insane force, and with how flimsy those things have always been, I knew it would take only their exit to possibly snap them right off. It takes lots of force to open and close those, and maybe that's how they plan to ensure I don't escape. But if so, then they really shouldn't damage the thing so badly. They threw me to the ground, my knees scraping across the thin layer of felt as I slid across the floor. I managed to slowly get up as I heard those fateful words and looked up toward none other than my mother, sitting in her chair like she was so innately superior to me. "My child, it is time that we use the last resort. You must be fixed, son, and I am the only one who can do it." I knew exactly what this meant. She was going to use bloodletting to purge the visions from my dreams. The keeper had told me that it's one of the most horrific things they do to anyone who strays from their path. Tears began to slowly fall down my face. Even though I always held them before, I couldn't keep away my fear any longer. Ever since I've had memories, I've had visions, and in a way I've always had the knowledge that I wouldn't be treated like someone on the path. I would always be kept back from a righteous life, and when I first started to tell my parents about it, their reaction just reassured those fears. When your whole life has been nothing but a vehicle for the greatest enemies of everyone you know to get what they want, at least according to the very people who raised you, then how are you ever supposed to not live every second on the edge of what may very well be a waking nightmare? How are you supposed to believe that anything you're being told is right when the path has been blocked off for you? How are you supposed to believe that there's a path whatsoever? Well, I don't. I'm sick of pretending as if I've done something wrong when, in reality, this entire group that I've been born into has been constructed around someone like me never existing, or at the very least never even being considered as one who is on the path, as one who should be treated the same way as everyone else who does their best to follow the rules of the overseer. I am a scapegoat, an enemy, even though I never wanted to be. But now that I know exactly how they react to an incidental enemy, I have become a purposeful one. I do not need to be fixed, Mother. You do. You've lived your entire life by what your visions have told you. Who are you to say that my visions aren't equally as, if not more, trustworthy than yours? She shook her head. I could tell she wanted me to think she was sad, but I knew she was just putting up a facade so I couldn't see her true anger toward my confrontational speech. "Child, the overseer himself spoke with me. He told me everything I could ever need to know. If the one speaking with you is truly correct, why would he not have spoken to me? It is clear that yours is an invader trying to plant false words of the underworld into your mind." I writhed in pain as I turned my body around to try and sit on the floor, managing to spit out a response despite my injuries. "And how can you be so certain that the word of the underworld wouldn't be able to come out before that of the overseer? Maybe our true enemies managed to trick you first. And now the overseer himself is speaking with me to fix the errors caused by you and your visions. No, that is just about enough, son. I wish to speak no longer of your demented sights. It is time we purge them forever." She gripped my arm with immense force, pulling me toward her and making me fall right onto the floor, which hurt like hell. She reached over to her side, and I nearly started to cry when I saw that smile start to plague her face. My mother is meant to care about me no matter what, meant to be there for me no matter what, especially with my father's condition, but no. At the slightest sign of contradiction with her group, I am thrown to the side, even though I never wanted to be born this way for so long. Though after being through the ringer because of her insanity, I think I'm happy to have been given these visions. I am happy to know the truth. I am happy to not be a sheep. I will bring down her house of lies until she has nowhere else to hide, because for my whole life I've been placed out in the open, used as a tool for mockery, ridicule, and the making of enemies. Her very own son has been a utility to her crusade against the parallel, showing she has lost any compassion for me. I know I should have accepted that long ago, but I can't get past the fact that I'll never have been granted a family who wishes for my best possible life. A family who feels like my family instead of my captors. She pulled out the massive blade with its unfathomable twists and edges. It looked nothing like any of the other blades I had been shown from the outside. I always knew such blades were used for ceremonies. Was that what the torture of her child was to her? She gripped me once again and pulled me toward the blade. I fought back with all of my strength, but she easily cut right through much of my arm's skin since there wasn't much of that left. I screamed in pain as the blood came gushing right out of my arm, pouring down onto my legs and the floor as she once again reached to get my other arm. I pulled my arm away from her as hard as I could, which sent both the blade and her flying. She fell right onto the floor next to me, and I could just feel that those psychos at the door were ready to start cutting me themselves, but I wouldn't let that happen. I used my less damaged arm to reach for the blade, then going over to my mother and planting it right up against her neck without hesitation. "You won't do this to me. You're my son," she mumbled into the floor. The guards both stopped lunging toward me as I brought the blade closer and closer to her neck. I didn't know if she was right or not. I didn't know if I could do something like this to anyone, even if they had treated me like this. They seemed to get less nervous the more I stalled, so I had to act quickly. I lifted the blade up high, and one of them attempted to tackle me, like the fool he was. I brought it down as soon as his feet left the ground and turned it to face away from me, causing him to jump right into his own grave. I had been trained for this fight my entire life, and I knew it had just begun. His body rested up against mine as his last lies attempted to claw their way out of his mouth before my still weak, but more invigorated voice interrupted him. "See you in hell." I took the blade right out of him and tossed it toward the other one, hitting him right in the thigh. I knew that such an injury wouldn't buy me much time, so I looked to where she had gotten the weapon in the first place, the left side of her throat. Surely enough, there was an assortment of blades all across it, and I quickly grabbed the longest knife I could find and threw it right into the bastard's jugular. With my current condition, I truly couldn't deal with any further confrontation, so I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. My mother stood up as I reached the door, and I stood there, facing her with my full motivation for the first time in my life. "You will never be part of the path. It will always be paved over for heathens such as yourself." I took a deep breath and thought of all my wounds, knowing such a saying was just another that I would fight through. "I will build a new path then, and you will be its antithesis. Goodbye, Mother. I'm sorry that you weren't smart enough to stop your own downfall." Chapter 5. Escape. I twisted my body around to face the door ahead of me, the first of many obstacles. I took a step back and braced my side to break through it, allowing my feet to spring ahead from the ground. I knocked right against it, feeling the shivers of pain creep throughout my body as my mother slowly trotted closer and closer toward me. I just knew that she'd try to use my weakness against me. There was no time to waste, so I broke through the pain and hit the door once again. This time I managed to break through the locks. Just one more push would open it up. I felt worse and worse, but I couldn't stop. This could very well be my only chance to get out of here, and I wish not to stay here any longer than I must. I pushed against the door one more time as my mother nearly gripped my clothes, but I broke through the entryway just in time. The horde of others stood there, glaring at me with pure malice, wanting to use the slight bit of force necessary to knock me down entirely. They stood there, scattered and near their own homes, staring down my former one as I began to run through the village I had known my entire life for what may hopefully be the last time. I rushed against the breeze, against their judgment, away from the tainted tether which kept me chained to my family and towards a bright destiny. My mother believed that I would heal the world, and I would aid her plan to break the parallel and save us all. But only one aspect of that is truly correct. I will save us all, but by doing the exact opposite of her plan. Perhaps she's right. Maybe the Keeper is a lie. Maybe the parallel is worth destroying. But if that's the case, I'll do it myself, and I'll enjoy taking it down right after I do the same to all of these sadistic, twisted monsters. Even if all I've known my whole life has been a lie from the Keeper, all I've known from my family and community has also been a lie, so I would under no circumstances act as if they don't deserve punishment. I looked all around, seeing the many buildings in which I had made memories both wonderful and horrific. To my left, among the menacing looks given to me by a gathering of merchants, I could see my old schoolhouse where I was rated the best warrior for our future, and I hoped that was true. I never believed I'd be granted such an accolade, especially as my family began to distrust me, even at such an early age. But that title stuck with me as something I could forever hold on to. I also saw my favorite eatery, at which I'd get the finest fruits and grains to bring back to my family every morning, which kept any tension at bay until later on. In that little look to my side, I felt a rush of love and emotion throughout as I dashed through my greatest memories, while I also rushed physically away from where they were stored. Between so many faces that, while recognizable, displayed an animalistic intent to annihilate me, I could really only stay focused on one, Vilatamar, the only person I had an interest in. Most of these people blended into the background for me, but Vilatamar was always fascinating, never fading into the sea of homogeneous fools in this crowd. He always seemed to stand alone, and though I was merely a spectator, I felt connected to everything he did, as if I could picture myself doing the same. But we had never even spoken a word to each other beyond typical formalities, and though we were strangers, the look of sympathy that he gave to me at this moment showcased that we should have become more. We could have really been great friends at another time, but losing the opportunity to be understood by one person here is better than losing the chance to be understood by countless numbers of others on the outside. And if a few of them are like the Keeper, then I think I will cease to miss what could have been. I turned my head over to the right like a bullet, letting those memories both true and dreamt of die in favor of gaining perspective on the threats around me, and the worst bits of my history that could inform me of the worst things to come. Immediately I was met with a few guards, holding their weapons firmly and readying their position. I had to veer over to the less threatening left side as they got closer and closer. I also saw the chamber in which I had just been held, thinking back to the fractures in my skeleton caused by their flowing stream of strikes against my body, and yet another one of my least favorite places in this entire field of damnation, the hospital. Ever since I was young, I was forced to go to the hospital for my visions, though using such a term for it feels practically fraudulent based on the disparities between it and the hospitals from the outside that the Keeper had briefly shown me. The tests they ran objectified me to the point of animalism, backing my humanity into a corner to create a perfect enemy and to get the proof they needed to justify whatever further actions they'd take against said enemy. Ready, my little visionary boy? That's what the doctors always asked me when I was younger to make it seem like I was special, like they wanted to do this because I had something amazing, even though I knew that wasn't really why. As time went on, they started to put away any attempts at disguising their true intentions, and just began the tests without so much as a sigh. They lost the ability to fake their compassion, maybe because they knew I wasn't buying it, maybe because they couldn't bother to treat me with the least bit of decency, maybe because my mother told them to cease pleasantry. It could have been any number of reasons. Every memory I've had opens up questions like this. Some of them have answers that are quite easy to find but hard to accept. Some of them are totally ambiguous even now, and some of them are just painful to the point I can't think of them. Memories are an interesting thing because without them, it'd be as if we never existed. Even we wouldn't believe that we did, but instead, we have this everlasting record within our minds that can bring us nearly any emotion in nearly any situation. But some emotions are so horrific that you never wish to revive them. Though when I look at that hospital, I can't help but answer my very own question. They stopped trying to be nice, to be pleasant, to be at the very least falsely decent, entirely because of my father. My father is a person who I don't like speaking of, but I suppose I can't stop this flowing streak of thoughts no matter how hard I try. He was always very dissimilar to my mother, with true compassion and attempts to connect with me throughout my life. He never gave up on me despite everyone else labeling me a heathen, a heretic. He stood by and let the hatred wash over him while he was making genuine steps toward giving me the best possible life. But all these attempts to help me out were constantly squashed by my mother's intervention, which was like the arrival of winter to newly planted crops. I don't know if it was true or not, but he was tried for being a heathen after having amassed quite a large group of speculative haters for himself. For helping his own child, he had become a public enemy, and so the court very hastily found him guilty of the most absurd accusations possible. He was placed through some truly awful sets of punishments, and I was barred from seeing him before the decision was made, meaning he only got one more chance to see me, which was when I was in the hospital for another round of tests. I had no clue that such a thing would happen, and I didn't even understand at the time what he was saying to me. I wasn't given a true idea of what had happened before my mother told me the story, and I had seen the horrific remains of the only person in my whole family who tried to love me instead of dismiss and punish me. A husk of a man had been made out of my father because he gave me a chance to live a happy life. Hey, kiddo. I'm gonna leave now. And I want you to remember what we did together. The fun times we had. Make sure to hold on to those because I don't think the number of them is gonna get any larger. I love you. I didn't know what to say, and I was stuck in the middle of an immobilizing experiment. I couldn't speak. I couldn't really move at all. I was a brain full of expressions unable to be expressed when my father said his last words to me. I just wanted to jump up and ask him what he meant, but I couldn't, and I'll never get the chance to have said goodbye back. But sometimes you just need to hear a goodbye and not say anything more. The pain on my right, the hatred surrounding me, the warmth to the distance on my left, and one great possibility stranded in a sea of fear. All of these things connect my memories to the present in this one moment, which went by extremely quickly in real time, but felt like an incredible journey for my own mind. Experience can happen in a second and take hours to be explained. As I continued to run, I could feel my body aching all over, but I had to keep going, and I did. I managed to get past the crowd as they started all chasing after me like an ocean of ire, spotting an old shed near the southern part of the village. This shed had a little tunnel built by one of our community's most infamous criminals, a killer named Pravil. It connected this tiny, decrepit shack to the farm which supplied us with food, and he used it to secretly take some of the animals before they were slaughtered and take their meat for himself. Eventually, his web of lies forced him to resort to killing humans too, and ever since they've boarded up the tunnel to prevent any such crimes from happening once again. But of course, that didn't last for very long, and they began using it to house additional livestock and feed more people. Even though the conditions there are unlivable, they found a way to sell more meat without spending money on any additional space for the animals, so naturally, they've used it. Thankfully though, this tunnel would once again cause some issues for them, as if I can use it to get inside of the farmhouse, I may be able to get to the roof and jump to a house near the outer wall. Whatever I did, it would have to be quick, because within moments I would be surrounded from every possible angle. I dashed out of the way of everyone behind me and backed right into the shed's tunnel, dashing and trying to avoid the hordes of cramped, miserable animals racing around my feet. I managed to get inside the farmhouse and locate a ladder, but a crowd of people was waiting right outside, and they'd notice me at the slightest noise. I could just feel the horror of what could happen. All the ones in this shed would get through the tunnels and find me, have their way with me, and then call over all the others to continue the torture. There was no time to think of such things, though, so I began climbing up the ladder as quickly as possible. It hurt so horrifically. I could just feel my wounds reopening as I stretched ever so slightly to reach up, but I had to keep my mouth completely shut if I wanted to stay alive. I continued up the ladder as the noises of a mob racing through the tunnels grew louder and louder, their chants and cries mixing with the screams of the trampled animals to create a horrific soundscape. Some of the people outside of the farmhouse heard the commotion and turned around, seeing me immediately and getting visibly excited at the prospect of throwing me off that ladder and brutally killing me. I just kept going, as I was nearly at the top, and they finally managed to get inside the farmhouse as I started to crawl onto the roof. I looked all around me, finding a row of 4 houses joined together right against the gate, the perfect landing spot. I stepped back and thought of how painful this was about to be, how absolutely horrific. I had to do it though, for the parallel, for my father, for Vladimir. Escaping was all that mattered. I ran as fast as I could and jumped across the ground, crashing into the roofs by the gate. I screamed out in pain and tried desperately to move around. Thankfully, my legs still worked, but my body felt like it was about to collapse. I crawled over to the gate and turned my body around, gripping onto the edge and relieving my grasp while pressing against the outer wall, allowing me to slide down more slowly. I lay there, on the ground, finally in the outside world. Only merchants, spies, and gatherers were allowed out here, and even then they were almost never permitted to go out of the forest and into towns or cities surrounding it. I was so close to the end of this nightmarish day, but first I had to get out of the forest. I knew they'd check outside of the gates at any point, and I may very well have left a trail of blood across those rooftops, so I needed to get going as quickly as possible. I tried again and again to get up, but I was simply too weak. I crawled across a pretty decent stretch of land before slumping up against a tree and nearly giving out entirely. No matter how much motivation I had, there are certain limits which no human can surpass. I could relax among the sounds of nature in my final moments, though, and one that stuck out to me especially was the movement of a liquid, almost like a small puddle or pond. I looked over and saw a dip in the ground full of a golden substance. It was so beautiful and unique, and I had no concept of what it could even be, but it called to me in some strange way. I didn't know if I'd be able to even move much more at all, so I crawled my way over to it. I soon saw multiple other dips around it, some with liquids of the same or different colors, some empty. I dipped my head down and reluctantly took a sip of it. As soon as I did, my body felt a rush of energy that I had never truly known before. It surged all the way through me again and again, almost like a clock rewinding every injury I had recently accumulated. I felt quite a bit better, though I could still feel that my body was massively damaged. It felt like just the boost I needed, like some sort of forbidden drug. I stood up as I could hear the wall behind me start to open, the mob having clearly found my blood. Just in time for them to get out and begin the search for me, I was able to stand once again and start hobbling away. Hobbling turned to walking, turned to jogging, turned to running, turned to sprinting faster than I ever had before. I was soon rushing through the forest gracefully, the fresh air of pure freedom blowing through my hair. Pushing through the crisp air of nature was a pleasure at the end of this truly awful, painful escape. Maybe there is an overseer, and maybe they blessed me just now. Maybe the overseer wants me to succeed, not my mother. And maybe, just maybe, the overseer placed that beautiful substance there for me, as it was truly a blessing. I finally started to see the trees become less frequent and gazed upon more buildings, these ones much more like those which the keeper had shown me, and they were truly beautiful. I was finally free, and now I could do the same favor for everyone else in there. Chapter 6. Belief. I looked around wildly, infatuated with the amazing sights around me. Buildings taller than anything I had ever seen, people walking all over in beautiful clothing, and no walls to lock this moment in. Ironic that the group dedicated to destroying the barrier between universes puts barriers around their very own people. I walked out onto the sidewalk, slowly making my way to the first building I could see. I gazed through the window and saw rows upon rows of people shoving products across a table as others waited on the other side while holding a trolley of sorts. I knew that I might be able to get help from somebody in here, so I walked to the door and reached for the handle. However, as soon as I could, it blasted open to the sides. I took a step back. The keeper had never shown me anything like this. I hesitantly stepped through the door, and nearly everyone glanced over at me quickly, then back to their previous focus, and looked at me once again, this time for much longer. They had a look of terror in their eyes as they all looked around at my bruises and cuts. I probably was the most ordinary-looking person here. I opened my mouth and got ready to say something, but with everyone gawking at me so ferociously, I didn't know what to say. A man let his basket fall to the ground and stepped over to me, placing his hand on my shoulder and asking quite a lot of questions. "Are you all right, son? You look like you've been beaten within an inch of your life. Where are you even coming from? I've never seen you around here before." I opened my mouth once again, glancing around at the others before responding slowly. I have been beaten. I need some help. A lot of help." He nodded and called out, "Can someone else help me carry him?" My heart sank. Where were they planning to take me? Being carried was never a good sign before. It either meant a beating or incarceration, but in the outside world, it could be even worse. "Wait, where are you taking me?" I blurted out. He kneeled down to meet my eye line and spoke calmly. "We're going to take you to the police. They'll make sure you're safe and that the people who did this can't do anything ever again. But you're too hurt to walk, so we're going to carry you to the car and get you there." I had heard of these people, the police, from the keeper. I knew this wouldn't be as bad as anything back there, most likely. A woman came over and she helped pick me up, allowing them to both carry me outside and to a car. They opened up the door and set me in the back seat very slowly, with the man thanking the woman and then readying the car to drive over to the police. He began to try and talk with me, as I tried to be as responsive as possible. "So, who exactly did this to you?" I took a moment to consider if I should say the truth or not, and the answer became clear quite quickly. "Well, I grew up in a cult. They did this." He took a deep breath and waited for a moment. I could even see part of his neck through the seat, and he was nodding. "And you got out of the cult?" The uncertainty in his voice led me to believe he thought I was full of it, but I pushed through and explained a bit further. "Yes, they beat me. They chased after me. I nearly died. But now I'm here." "Do you really think the police will be able to help me?" He shook his head. I could tell he was starting to take me a bit more seriously now. After all, I had blood all over my shirt. "Well, I'm not entirely sure, but they're going to try and help you. I don't know what exactly they're able to do about this, but if there is a cult around here doing this, maybe you can help them find it." I nodded slowly and laid back down on the other car seat, feeling the vibrations of the road being rolled over so rapidly was relaxing. I had never really seen the outside world beyond what the keeper had shown me, but so far it seemed quite similar. The small glimpse I got into what they call a town was nice, and maybe once my purpose is fulfilled I can experience more of it. I glanced out of the window after sitting up a bit more, looking out toward the forest that gracefully let the sun cut through it like a blade. "How much longer until we're there?" I asked. He lifted his hand from the wheel and let it fall back onto it softly. "It shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. We're almost out of the woods now and we'll be in the city. Is that going to be a problem?" "No, I'll be able to hold on for a while longer. I'm pretty sure." I continued looking outside. The forest purely mesmerized me. The thought that something of human creation so entirely delusional and evil could exist wrapped beneath such a beautiful environment is mind-boggling. The window on the other side blasted open, shards of glass flying everywhere. I looked over toward it and saw that a memorial rock had been thrown. A rock with my sick monster of a mother glorified on it was the first thing to hit the car, as more stones and bricks continued to smash against the sides. The driver screamed out, "What the hell is this?" He swerved the car around to try and avoid the oncoming cultists, who began rushing out toward us with their blades and rocks. They attempted continuously to break the car down, but seemingly to no avail, until suddenly I could hear a popping sound. I looked through the other window to see that a cultist with a spear had punctured one of the tires. "What the hell? Who are these freaks?" he cried out once again. I think the tire just got slashed." He looked back at me and continued to drive the car as far as it would go. Then he fully turned around once we totally stopped and spoke once again. "You listen to me. You get out of the same side as me and run along with me perfectly. Then, once we've broken through the crowd, I need you to run as fast as possible. Understand?" I nodded as a cultist rushed toward his window with a hammer. He opened the door right before impact, causing it to fly into the attacker. He walked out and grabbed the hammer, beginning to fend off the others quite effectively. I got out of the car and rushed to the right behind him. "Listen, kid, I don't really count myself lucky for being your driver on this trip, but at this point, all I hope is that you'll make it. Follow me for a bit longer." A cultist managed to jab him right in the side. As he began to fall to the ground, I had to do something, fast. I kicked in the direction of the spear, snapping it in half. I pulled the half with the blade out of him, tears beginning to stream down my face in this battle of depravity once again, and shoved it right into his killer's abdomen. I pulled it right back out and began to run down the road again, the crowd of a dozen or so crazed maniacs chasing after me. It continuously felt like they were about to get me, but I just kept running. I finally started to see the tree line break as more and more of them stopped chasing. It was incredibly strange. They seemed almost repelled by the city as I began to enter it, and I began to feel more secure as a result. I looked around desperately. With people all over the streets, I knew someone would be able to help. I rushed over to a man in a green sweater and began to frantically ask him questions. I knew that entering the city was forbidden for those freaks, but who knows what sort of insane attack they could have prepared already. Do you know where I could find the police station?" I asked, trembling at an insane rate. "Well, I think it might be around there." He pointed over to my right, and I began to rush over in that direction. Even though there was still a chance of them finding me here, I felt truly free as I looked around this unfamiliar city, feeling like I was at home despite never having seen it in my life. I guess that's what happened when your real home really sucks. Anything better starts to feel perfectly natural. I ran and ran through the cold air, not knowing when I'd finally get there, but I knew I had to hold out hope. Eventually, I saw it, a bright blue sign on a large building which read "Police." I walked up to it and opened the door slowly, looking inside and seeing a man sitting at a table. I walked over to him and began to speak once again, this time nearly breaking down completely due to relief. I need help. I need help. Can you give me help?" He looked up at me with concern and terror. "What do you mean? Are you in need of rehab? Is there someone after you? Are you hurt? What do you need help with?" I slowly held up my hand before I could feel the crash coming. Whatever I drank before had worn off by now, and yet I was so close. I felt all the pain come surging back, and the shock nearly killed me. I fainted barely a second after holding up fingers implying 2. I woke up in a grimy room, surrounded by gray walls and some sort of mirror. I was sitting down, which was strange, and as I opened my eyes further, I saw a different man sitting across from me, laying his hands on the metal table. "So, son, what exactly are you doing here? You came in last night asking for help and then fainted, and we found blood and injuries all over your body. Some of that blood was the same type as yours. Some was definitely not. Can you explain what's going on here? I just need to talk with you." Chapter 7. Interrogation. I gazed right into the man's eyes. I could see a very real concern within them. He was smothered head to toe in uniform, not unlike the leaders of my cult, and he absolutely towered over me once he placed his hands on the table more forcefully and stood up. I felt the same deprivation of power that was always thrown at me, but this time more out of uncertainty than sheer pain. "Hello? Can you please say something? I realized I had completely blocked out what he had said and simply stared off into the distance. Yes. Where am I? He took his hands off the table and slowly paced around. You're here in the police station. You're safe. You fainted and we sent you to the hospital to treat your wounds. And though you seemingly woke up there once or twice, I suppose you weren't fully conscious back then. Now we're here in the station to ask you a few questions. We found a car and a body nearby and are very concerned, he said, clearly genuine. It was strange almost, seeing something said in that tone. I hoped it wasn't secretly filled with malice. All right, I'll answer your questions. He nodded. Firstly, what is your name, date of birth, and where do you come from? He asked, robotically. I'm Hælend. I was born on the date of Shards 517, and I came from the ordinance of the Overseer. It's a cult that's right around here, but I managed to escape. He looked at me with a very puzzled expression once I stated my date of birth, though I continued on in the same machine-like way that he had previously spoken, disregarding it until I had finished. Can we go back to your birth date for a moment? What did you say that was? I prepared to repeat myself and spoke with much more hesitancy this time around. The date of Shards 517. Is there something wrong with that? He bit his lip and glared a bit more tightly. I'm not sure what that means at all. Could you maybe give me a date with a month, a year? It started to sound more familiar as he described it like that. I remembered that at a certain point the keeper had taught me a similar concept. Apparently in the outside world, people measure time quite differently from the ordinance, using months, days, and years, I believe. I tried as best I could to remember, as the keeper at one point told me what it was. I closed my eyes tightly and began to think. What are you doing? He asked, though it seemed quite obvious. Trying to remember what the old man in my head who controls the balance of the universe told me was my date of birth. I think I had gotten it. June 17th, 1947? I'm not sure, but I believe that's correct. I was incredibly thankful for such a memory, as it really came in handy. Alright then. Now, tell me a bit more about this cult, Hælend. I opened my eyes and now had to bring back some memories of very different emotional impacts. I've been there since birth, as far as I know. My mother and father, they were both part of it. Every experience I've had up until recently has been within the walls of their compound, I said, already feeling a bit uneasy. How do they operate exactly? He asked, clearly getting interested now. They were extremely devoted to my mother. She's had visions since birth that tell her to destroy something. It's like a pane of glass, and she wants to crack it. They all do. He tilted his head. A pane of glass? Why would they want to crack something like that? I looked upward and thought of how to explain such an insane thing, knowing that he would probably still be confused no matter how I phrased my next sentence. It's not a pane of glass. It's not just a pane of glass, at least. It looks like one, but it's massive, and it's more important than you could ever know. I've had visions too since birth, and I've been shown another side of this. You probably won't believe me, but I've seen something truly beautiful that keeps us safe. It's the barrier between us and another universe, and my mother has a demented, destructive vendetta against it. She and her followers wish not to hear me out, though. He winced and began to look a bit more irritated. Listen, this isn't time for stories. Clearly something's wrong with you, but if this cult really does exist, and they're behind this body, then we need to deal with it. Where's this supposed compound? He didn't believe me, as expected, but I still could get him to help me stop them by other means. In the forest. It's deep within the woods, but you're not going to want to go there alone. Bring every person you can over there, because they're vicious. They killed that man in his car without so much as a moment of deliberation. There hasn't once been a sort of filibuster when I am to be beaten. They killed my father, for God's sake! I slammed my hand on the table as tears began to run down my face. The genuine emotion started to sway him from apathy to confusion as he readied a response. So you're saying that they've beaten you? Is that what caused all of those wounds? I slowed my heavy breathing and opened my mouth. Yes, that and escaping. I've been through hell and back to escape their grasp, and my whole life I've been nothing but a poster child for their demonization of anyone stepping outside of their path. You have to help me, because I'm far from the only person at risk here. He interrupted me abruptly. Hey now, let me make my decision, son. I'm going to look through the forest for a bit with a few other officers, but we're going to see if we can find this compound. If this is really so serious, we'll take a look. All right? I shook my head violently and began to speak more ferociously. No, you need to wage war against them. That's the only way. I swear on my life and the life of every single other soul on this earth, this universe, that it's vital. You've already lost an innocent life. There's no telling how many others could perish once it's too late. If you and a few others walk out into that forest, they will find you, capture you, and put you through the worst hell imaginable. You may have powerful weapons, but unless you bring enough manpower, you'll never outweigh the power of an ambush. He rubbed the side of his face with his hand and sighed. I'm sorry, but no matter how much I want to believe you, there's no way I can send a legion of officers to investigate something a 13-year-old kid is rambling about without any evidence. If there's real proof, then we'll take this as seriously as you are. But I can't make such a rash decision on a rumor. I don't know who you are, I've never seen you around here before, and for all I know, you could be some escapee from the loony bin. Proof. That's what he clearly needed. I had to think of something that could prove the cult's existence, and I think I had an idea. Do you have the body? I asked, the dead air filling the room immediately thereafter. Yes. Why does that matter? He asked. I smiled a little bit, realizing what this meant. Did you see any symbols on it? Did you see any symbols on my body when I was placed into the hospital? He looked at me with intrigue. I don't know. I pulled up my shirt a bit to reveal the symbol burned into my back. He stepped over with immense urgency to view it. Heretic. Visions of the Underworld. I'd been given it about 2 years ago, as I started getting more defensive of the visions after my father had been killed. He stepped back in pure terror after seeing it, trying to speak but purely unable to. Check the body. Check the back of the body. He stood there with his jaw wide open, shocked. All right, I'll ask and see if there's any such thing on it. He left the room and I had to wait there. Time seemed to crawl by at a snail's pace. I stared at the strange mirror in the room and thought of the parallel once again. I wish I could just live there at this point. With the keeper. The outside world was much better than the compound, but I still missed my visions quite a bit. The keeper taught me nearly everything I knew about the outside world, and I don't know if I ever would have gotten this far without him. I probably wouldn't have even reconsidered my involvement in the cult. I would have simply followed along with my mother. I suppose the positive of that is not being beaten and ostracized by everyone around me for my life, but I would rather fight against the evil surrounding me and be hated for it than succumb to it and be evil myself. The door finally opened back up after what felt like an eternity, and the man stepped back in. As it happens, that same symbol was found in a very similar position on the body. This means one of two things. It either means that a cult exists around here and is behind not only this murder, but the string of other accusations that you've brought up, or that a 13-year-old kid has come up with a story about a cult, bruised and damaged himself to the point of near death, killed a man, and branded a custom image into his own skin and the skin of his victim. Now, which of those sounds more likely to you? He smiled a bit, and I smiled back, knowing that he believed me at this point. I'd say the first option. He nodded and began to look more serious. I just sent a team to scout out the area very cautiously and look for signs of their exact location. But once they find out where it is, we need you to do something very important. We will raid the compound and attempt to find the leaders, but we're going to need a way to distract the followers before we even get there. I didn't know what was about to come, but I felt like he knew I wasn't going to like it. I want you to go back there. We plan to have you there with a group of officers who will be disguised as some sort of other fringe group. If we don't manage to keep these followers occupied, this could end in the worst way imaginable. Your mother, she's a leader, right? I nodded. Well, unless we can capture the leaders before they issue orders to people and realize the police have found them, they could do something truly horrific that we've seen happen before. I don't want a repeat of that. So you need to work with us, alright? I'll tell you the plan once we've found out where they are. I looked to the ground and tried to hide my smile. Yes, I will cooperate. They allowed me to stay there overnight, and for the first night of my life, I felt entirely secure. I didn't want to go back there with so much uncertainty pervading the situation, but if it meant I would take them down, I was all for it. Finally, in the morning, the man came to me and told me that they had found the compound. We spotted the area you're talking about, and it's like nothing we've seen before. It looks like some sort of ancient ruin, but we managed to get a view from a nearby hill and can confirm that people are living in it. We've created an escape route if anything goes wrong, but for now, the plan is to have you speak to them. We can't do much by ourselves to distract them, even with disguises. But if you're treated like a victim of ours and a martyr for the cult, and can give a convincing speech, they'll not pay attention to where the leaders are. Typically in these sorts of cults, the leaders wouldn't be in the same area as the common folk during an event like your speech. Do you think it would be the same for this one? I thought back to where my mother always would be. She always sat in that chair, no matter what was going on. It was almost as if she was some sort of machine, simply placed into an area for one express purpose, in this case to produce the visions by which all others in the compound would live their lives. However, she wasn't the only leader. Multiple members of the religious institutions held high power, but they too paid little to no mind to what happened outside. They were so disconnected from the lives of their followers and dedicated to their work against the parallel that they were almost like farmers to livestock. The leaders only interacted with the typical cultist if they needed something or wanted to give punishment, so I believed it would work out if I gave my speech. Yes, I think that will work. He smiled, and I began getting ready for the most important next step yet, the speech that would set the stage for warfare. Chapter 8. Speech. We arrived at the gates, and they shoved a bag right over my head, blocking my vision and leaving me off with a few final words of comfort. We have to make this believable, but if anything goes wrong, we have a plan. Distract them for as long as you can, and make sure that that's believable as well. I could feel many motions around me, but I was blind to what all of them entailed. Eventually, I could hear the sounds of cultists rumbling around until a much louder noise took over. Look upon our wrath! It was time. The police were beginning to speak. We have captured one of your very own. He will face our divine punishment in front of you all, and this is simply the first of many attacks. We are the Trau, and we know all about you heathens. The true overseer knows all about you. He knows you are a stain on this world, and we plan to purge you. This is the first step. The bag was finally removed, and I put on my best performance of being held captive. I certainly had enough past material to work with. We want him to give his last words to you. We are no animals, unlike you. If anyone tries to get rowdy, we will open fire. They held their guns believably, as I knew the two officers around me wished that they could be included in the fight that the others were doing. They pushed me to the ground quite hard, and I slowly stood up, facing the insurmountable crowd ahead of me. Just 2 days before, I had been rushing away from them with my life nearly gone, and now they gathered around, hanging on to what I was to say. I took a deep breath and prepared, looking into the sea of violent, disturbed, confused, hurt, and sometimes, just sometimes, innocent people of which I had seen the true darkness. It must destroy you all to see me here. It must be absolutely hurtful. No, it is not. You all want this to happen deep down. Admit it. The men behind me may be moments away from blowing my brains out in front of all of you, but that doesn't change the fact that you'd all do the exact same if you'd had the chance. I didn't give it to you, though, because I will not be taken down by you freaks. My whole life you have all treated me like the enemy, though I was simply instructed to help the world, to heal the world. Is that not what my mother wanted? Is that not what you all supposedly wanted? Or did you all secretly just want to see me hurt, to see me die, to see misfortune befall anyone who stepped out of the path? You act all high and mighty, sitting within your carefully chosen route of life, but you never think of what's outside of that. As soon as something that you didn't expect enters your realm, you lose your minds and show your true colors. But think about this from my perspective for once in your damn lives. I was born with nothing but unfamiliarity. A man spoke to me in my dreams and told me that everything surrounding me was evil. My mother sent me off to be some lab rat without a sign of hesitancy, and when my father tried to show the smallest sign of care for me, you all declared him some kind of monster. When I escaped here, I was more beaten down than I ever had been. I was near the point of death, but I kept going. The reason why is because I would have rather died from brutal injuries and exhaustion than been trapped within these walls for another moment, cursed to live every day as the subject of your ridicule, your lecturing, your hatred, your mistreatment, your demonization, and your torture. Is that not a life you would all give anything to escape? Practically none of you gave a second thought to the hunt against me. You all just gave in and tried to take me. But let me ask you this. Would you be able to hold the bone of another tortured soul and beat me with it? Because that is what I have had to endure. Some of you have gone far, far away from the path to punish me. But because I have been the enemy that you all focus on, it has never truly crossed your minds. Sometimes I've wondered if it's worth even continuing when this is my life. And that's why I never would have stopped trying to escape. Every day if you captured me, I would try again the next until it worked or until it killed me. But it worked. I got away from all of you, and the outside world was a breath of fresh air. True life was shown to me for the very first time. So now I don't need to contemplate anyone's demise but yours. No longer is my death at your hands on the table. You will all be taken down, your path will be destroyed, and the parallel will live on. You all act as if the parallel is to blame for all the misery in this world, and that we can solve that simply with its demise. But if that's true, then answer me this. Why have you all created more misery for me, for so many others, than I have ever seen done by the parallel? When I travel there in my visions, it is warm, welcoming, inviting, and more comfortable at any time than this hellhole in the best of moments. So maybe take a look into a mirror for once. Maybe take a look into the biggest one in the universe and see that the evil is not contained within that barrier, but within you. At this point, I was breathing more heavily than I ever had, my heart racing, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't believe that I had finally said all of that. I couldn't believe that I had gotten the chance to say a word of it to all of them. I began to smile a bit, knowing that even if everything fell apart right in this moment, I had finally gotten it all out. I had finally confronted the people who tormented me, directly and indirectly, for my entire life. The elation was unlike anything I had ever felt. The crowd stood completely still once I finished speaking. My sobbing and laughing was the only noise that filled the air. I saw faces that were shaken, some crying, others looking down at the ground, clearly unable to process what I had said, and only a small number continued to give their smug, judgmental faces. Among them were the guards who had beaten me, clearly disturbed individuals, a few religious men, and my mother? This was not supposed to happen. My face went from elated to mortified immediately as her gaze pierced through my relief. I looked over at the officers with horror, but their eyes were hidden. I looked back to the crowd and she remained there. I looked all over the place, trying to find where the other officers were. It looked like the church's lights were turned off. They had taken down the religious leaders. However, one of the people in the crowd noticed and was terrified. He shouted out about it, and soon the crowd was in total disarray. They began rushing toward the church as the man who had gotten me into this entire situation, Pravil, raised his bloodied hand at the top of the building. This was not going as planned, not at all, and I could see some members of the crowd rush off into the distance, knowing the fate that was to come. I turned back to the officers and tried to figure out what was next. "This isn't good at all. They know something's up. What do we do now?" One of them took off his disguise, and I could see his face clearly now. He was the man who talked to me before at the station, and he looked extremely prepared for this, though I was not whatsoever. "Well, we fight. This is the war now, and it's time to put an end to your mother's rule." Chapter 9. War. After he finished speaking, he gripped my arm and rushed over to the left side of the compound, far away from the crowd. As we ran, he began to ask me questions. "Do any of these places have somewhere where you can hide?" I thought about it, and unfortunately, nothing came to my mind apart from the farm. "Yes, there's a tunnel between a shed and the farm. If you turn right past that brown hut, we'll see it shortly." "All right, let's do this." He cut diagonally through, and I could glimpse over to my side to see what was going on. The crowd of people was beginning to break into the church, trying to take down the cops within. All the while, some of them had managed to get to the roof. As I got another angle through some more huts, I saw what they were doing up there, hopping across the rooftops as I had to escape. These officers were equipped with some sort of weapon. "Do they have guns?" I asked, unaware of what exactly was to happen in this disastrous of a situation. He had mentioned a war, but I never assumed things were meant to go this badly. "Yes, tranquilizers. They'll sedate the crowd so that we can detain the right people and deal with this whole mess." That was good to hear. Even though many people in the crowd had done awful things, the looks on their faces after my speech were genuine enough that I could still see true humanity, so it was good that they weren't simply going to be slaughtered. We arrived at the shed, and he opened the door, saying one last thing before slamming it shut. "Stay in here. This war isn't for you to witness." I was now stuck in there. It was cold, damp, and miserable, but much better than trying to avoid death. I had learned to fight, and though I knew it was foolish, I wanted to use that knowledge deep down. I thought back to a memory I had with the Keeper. It was around 3 years ago. I had been training to fight using the cult's own weapons against them, and I finally made a breakthrough. "You're getting quite good with that blade there. Let's put your skill to the test," he said, playfully, pulling out his own blade so we could spar. I took my time and lackadaisically crept toward him, learning from all the times I had foolishly sprinted. I made one swipe, and he matched me in retaliation. However, I managed to quickly recognize his angle and dodge. All the times I had made blunders helped me understand how I needed to handle this fight. Against the cultists, it would not be controlled, so I needed to be properly prepared for the ultimate fight, and any such mistakes would have to be ironed out. We continued to try and get hits in on each other until I finally managed to use the right positioning and hit him with lots of force. It kept going like that, as I had finally learned to take my time. I was a bit worried, despite having learned so much, because there was easily the possibility that my fury toward the cult would take over, and I would focus more on rage than strategy. But if there was ever a time to lose sight of my training, it was not now. Being trapped in here, while by no means pleasant, felt normal. In a way, I had been trapped in a limited space my entire life, so this just felt as if I was going back to what I had known. I began feeling a motion at my ankle, like something was rubbing up against my leg. I looked down and saw through the darkness that a pig was gleefully chewing on my pant leg. I pulled away and decided to start moving a bit. Maybe I would be able to see what was going on from the farmhouse. I began making my way through the sea of animals once again. The smell made me want to vomit profusely. I finally got to the other side and crawled up to the inside of the farm. I peeked around the corner of the exit and could see into the outside a bit better. The crowd was still pretty large and raging, but some of them were on the ground, tranquilized. Shots kept coming from above with incredible accuracy, but the horde was so hell-bent on entering that church and getting some blood on their hands that they paid practically no mind to the fact that they could fall at any moment. After a minute or two more, they managed to burst through the church, and I could hear yelling and screaming to an unfathomable degree. Shots from the tranquilizers continued to make noises of their soft impact, but eventually I heard two truly defining noises. At first, the scream of a police officer who had been possibly stabbed, followed by the loud pop of a real gun. Multiple members of the crowd screamed in terror, and the gunshots continued further and further. It was apparent that, at this point, it was a true bloodbath. The shots died down, most likely because the crowd had finally overtaken the officer with the weapon. I just hoped it wasn't the one I had known. I decided it was safe to step out a bit and peek from a different angle, so I moved to one of the beams holding up the higher level and looked, this time to my left. I could now see that the cultists had gotten onto the roof and were brutalizing the officers who were using the tranquilizing guns. Real gunshots picked back up from across the rooftops, and this time I got a view of multiple attacks. One group of cultists jumped over from the left to a building directly ahead of me, and the officer shot multiple of them. Their bodies fell to the ground with a horrific splatter of blood accompanying them. The lifeless gaze met my eyes for a moment as I looked at one of the falling corpses, and it gave me a disturbing feeling unlike any other. I looked back up and saw that another cultist had flanked him from the right and gained the upper hand, beating him into a pulp in a disgusting display that I couldn't bear to witness. More and more carnage surrounded me as the reinforcements arrived and rushed toward the crowd, who were still finishing off the previous officers. Now the battle was taken to the ground, and my role as a spectator became even more of a burden as a result. They charged at one another. Some officers with clubs and shields got up close and personal, while more non-lethal shots came from the distance. A few cultists had weapons and blades at this point, making it much more of a bloodbath. Multiple police had their shields knocked away, and they were brutally stabbed afterward. Yet another one of them down due to their own failure causing such a violent outcome. If only they were more strategic, none of this depravity would have been released at such an absurd rate. At this point, I couldn't even really tell who had the upper hand. The blood and screams raided the air and blocked out any possible normality. Then, an officer began retreating into the farmhouse. Thankfully, he was walking back into it, giving me a perfect chance to escape back into the tunnel. I scampered across the wall and neared it. However, I was quickly spotted. A gunshot went off and the officer brutally killed a cultist, absolutely remorseless. Then, he turned to me and pointed the gun right at me. "Where do you think you're going, freak?" I turned around with my hands up and began to calmly explain myself. I guess not everyone was informed. I'm the escapee. I'm on your side. He stepped a bit closer and smirked. "What are you on about? All I know is that there's one thing I'm here to do. Slaughter all the crazies." I looked all over. I was terrified. I suppose that the instructions on this entire plan weren't told in the same way to everyone, and this misinterpretation, or worse, was about to prove fatal. I couldn't be stopped now. Not like this. I was so close, and I was to be killed by some coward who shoots from a distance and doesn't face the cult head on? Then, out of nowhere, the officer was tackled to the ground. The gun went off, but it also flew out of his hands while doing so, meaning I wasn't hit. I rushed immediately into the tunnel and looked from there. A cultist had brought him to the ground and stabbed him with a blade repeatedly. I knew I would be next, so I rushed back out of the tunnel, around the cultist, and grabbed the gun. I aimed at the cultist, feeling a rush of guilt. Was I to fight like this as well? I moved my aim from his head to his leg and fired, causing him to collapse onto the ground and drop his blade. I grabbed it and stabbed his other leg to stop him from moving any further, and then looked out onto the battlefield once again. In just a few moments, the death toll had risen massively, with only a few skirmishes playing out at this point and a mountain of bodies surrounding the remaining fights. I wanted to believe that most of those were simply knocked out, but I knew that, at this point in the fight, that wasn't true. At this point, I just wanted to find my mother and put an end to this. I grabbed onto the ladder and started climbing up, and as I looked out I could see even more horrors across the compound. But through all the bodies and stories contained within the most gruesome sights, I couldn't help but fixate on one thing, the sheer desolation of the entire place. Almost nobody was there, but I could spot one very important person as I walked around the different sides of the rooftop. I could see her, my mother, sitting there. Right outside of our hut, she was sitting there in some sort of pose, almost taunting me with the peacefulness of her current status. She knew I was there to put an end to her reign, and she wanted to anchor me until I lost focus. I spotted one last detail, though, as I made my way down the ladder and walked toward the hut. It became exceedingly clear that she had something in her lap, something spherical and white, but with smudges of dirt all over it, and as I got incredibly close, I finally realized that she was holding none other than a skull. Her evil on full display, I began walking more quickly, and once I was mere steps away, she started standing up, opening her eyes and facing me. I gripped my blade tightly and positioned myself properly for the most important fight of my life yet. Hello, Mother. Chapter 10. Showdown. This was it. I was finally about to achieve the retribution for which I had always yearned. She stood there, totally silent for what felt like an eternity. I didn't know if, in this strange silence, I was meant to begin attacking. I stood there, just as motionless as her, because I was in no way expecting such a situation. Eventually, I grew tired of the dead air and gripped my blade as tightly as I could, then walking toward her forcefully. She seemed to smile a bit, but I was completely unmoved by her response. I got right up in front of her and swung my blade to hit her arm, and I chopped right through it. However, she simply stood there, as if her arm hadn't just fallen off, and as if a trail of blood hadn't followed. Her lack of a reaction terrified me, but I couldn't be distracted from my goal, so I brought my blade high and struck her right in the head. This time, though, nothing came of it. It was almost as if the blade was dull, but when I looked back over at where her arm was, I saw the true cause of the weapon's failure to have an effect. Another arm began to crawl out of her, like some sort of grotesque mutation, but within a few seconds, it looked just like any normal appendage. I stepped back with pure horror, as she very clearly had some sort of advantage, the full possibilities of which I wished not to see. Then she finally spoke. You are going to see what the Overseer can do, son. You are going to see the Lord that you so clearly betrayed take hold of this world. You will regret your sin. You have already lost, you and the underworld, and now is the first showcase of such failure. She raised her hand slowly, brought it back a bit, and motioned forward incredibly harshly. All of a sudden, a blast of color shot into my eyes, and I could feel that I was being thrown across the ground as if she had pushed me without even touching me. At this point, I simply started to run, as I didn't know what other strange attacks she was capable of. Was I really wrong? Was there truly an overseer behind all of this? Well, if there is one, then he's a real scumbag for letting all of this happen, and I don't feel the least bit guilty for not appeasing such a leader. I rushed across the area with her slowly following behind me. Once again, her lack of urgency was truly chilling. I didn't know what to do. I ran all over the place, trying to avoid the remaining scuffles of the war until I finally found one of the many corpses in the pile that I had previously spotted. Below me were two bodies, a police officer and a cultist, and they seemed to be facing away from each other, strangely enough. I noticed that they both had a bullet to their backs, meaning that they were most likely gunned down by another person entirely. I looked to the officer in the hopes of finding a gun, but was disappointed on that front, so I tried to see what the cultist had. Yet another blade of the same type as mine, but this time they had a canteen sewn into the belt around their waist. I grabbed it and pulled it out of the belt, then drinking it. Not after my pure, frantic desperation had faded, I realized that it very clearly could have been some sort of poison, but I felt a very different, much more positive sensation after drinking it. I quickly recognized exactly what it was, namely the strange golden liquid that had previously saved my life in the forest. However, this one looked to be a much darker color. I felt a surge of power through my veins once again, but this time my mind gained the sensation of new interactions. It was as if I had gotten another arm, and I began to try and control some of these new possibilities as my mother got dangerously close. Eventually, I managed to think of something. That liquid in the forest had given me new strength and vigor, and this one felt incredibly similar, but only distinct in how it opened up new things for my body to control, meaning it very well could have been what allowed my mother to initiate that brutal attack against me. I took a deep breath, brought my arm back, and stuck it back out with insane force as she got just feet away from where I was. With that, I felt something incredible, something spiritual, untethered to my physical or mental appendages, rocketed out of my hand and right at her, sending her flying back all of a sudden. She grew angry with this action, grabbing her own blade from a pouch and then gesturing her hand down to the ground. With this, she flew up into the air and began to fall back toward me. She positioned the blade as if she was to cut straight through me using the force of her fall. Clearly, the motion of her hand in tandem with signaling from the brain could lead to these different outcomes. So I tried something of my own. I reached to the side, where her hut was situated, and acted as if I was pulling toward it. Surely enough, this worked. It was incredible how such an insignificant amount of force could result in a greatly more impactful action. I rocketed toward the hut and nearly crashed into it, but, pressing my luck, I made a motion to push against it. I gazed back at where my mother had landed to see her precise position, and then shot right back at that angle. I crashed right into her, continuing to fly through the air. I looked up, trying to get a grip on this insane thrill ride, and I saw that I was quite close to part of the compound wall. I pushed her forward once I was even closer, so that she'd crash right into it while jumping off of what would soon be her corpse and landing safely on the ground. After another moment of waiting, she finally crashed straight into the wall and looked to be incredibly injured. At this point, I knew it would be possible to kill her, as she had started reacting to pain once again. I began sprinting toward the wall until I found another corpse. This one was yet another officer, and I took his gun, getting ready to put an end to this. I held it steady as I aimed for her and fired the first shot. Though the keeper never gave me that much of an idea on how these things worked, I knew the basics. And, more importantly, I knew that it would only take a few shots to put this monster down. I got extremely close to her and fired once again, this time managing to get the bullet right through her head. Her eyes dialed back, and she seemed to die after this, but I couldn't leave it uncertain. I grabbed the blade that she had been holding and lifted it up, but as I was bringing it down, yet another flash of color appeared in front of me. I couldn't believe it, but she was still alive and managed to blast me away before I could finally put her to rest. At this point, I was fuming, but there wasn't too much I could do as I felt these new abilities begin to fade away. I turned around and began to run once again, though I resented the very idea of fleeing from such a vital task as fighting her. As I ran, I managed to grab the blade that I had just dropped, part of this never-ending struggle to keep defenses. Multiple cultists spotted me and joined in on chasing after me, but I was determined to get away from them by any means necessary. All I needed was to find a good spot to ambush, and I could have a shot at stopping her. At this point, it was quite clear that she wasn't exactly impeded by the limited supply of that liquid that I had, meaning this would be much harder than fighting any old crazy person. I managed to get into a house that looked abandoned and used a nearby chest to block the door. I scurried up the stairs and pushed open the grill of the window to escape onto the roof. I looked around from the side of the house to try and find where she was until I eventually spotted her close to the crowd that was now trying to burst open the door. Once she got past the overhang of the roof, I slipped off of it and ended up right behind her. I twisted the blade around with mastery, knowing that this was the next pivotal strike. I lifted it up and managed to stab right through her chest. I knew that wouldn't be enough, so I lifted it again, with it going through her torso this time. I continuously brought that blade down with all the force I could muster as the crowd around me desperately tried to peel me away from their leader. However, I was not to be stopped. Not their chance for my blood, not their physical touch that would, under any other circumstances, bring me down. Nothing was going to stop my attacks. Then I felt the brightest flash of color yet, but this time it was not from an outside force. This spiritual strength blasted out of me and pushed all of the oncoming cultists back, forcing them to the ground. With that, though, I collapsed. This was something truly special. I previously felt totally without the powers of that liquid, but it seemed that I no longer needed it, as if I was granted the permanent value of it. I had fallen at this point, but I knew I couldn't give in to my weakness just yet, as the spectacle I had surely made would attract many threats. I waited for them to come and take me, uncertain of what would happen next, but I heard, saw, nor felt anything until a single gunshot raced through the air. I crawled around until I could see behind me and was witness to none other than the man who had brought me here. He rushed over and lifted me up, holding me as it was clear that I was unable to walk. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I noticed his body was trembling, as he had probably just been through a similar sort of hell as I. He carried me through the compound as I gazed upon more corpses, pools of blood and ash, and homes that I had once known completely destroyed. I always thought that seeing the end of this horrific place would be cathartic in a way, but that was far from accurate. All I could fear was regret for everyone lumped into this, everyone who had fallen for it, because they simply succumbed to what they thought was righteous. Most of all, I thought of the people among those corpses who may never have wanted anything like this, because, in this clearly cruel world, I doubt they didn't suffer the most. I thought of Vladimir, a boy with no malice in his heart, yet he was likely gunned down with as much cruelty as the ones who had beaten me. Even my mother isn't to blame for all of this. She simply has been manipulated her whole life to engage in these terrible acts, and maybe, all along, I had been the same way. As I looked through the flames of torture and death that engulfed me, I couldn't help but consider that I was just like my mother. Maybe the Keeper wanted such a horrific retaliation all along, and though that doesn't excuse what the cult did, it means that I was just as much a tool of some strange person as the woman who I just shot in the head. I could feel the officer trembling a bit as he held me, and when I looked up at his face, I could see a tear crawling down it. Through the certain, powerful exterior of these officers, there was a core subject to terror at the slightest sign of uncertainty, and through the purely demented exterior of the cultists, there was a real individual, tainted only by this horrific makeshift society based on a lie. "We're here. Are you all right?" he asked, at this point completely sobbing. Once we got to his car, I had no words to say, only thoughts to try and recover from. My brain was a brutal machine, pumping the worst ideas imaginable into my body, but I had to fight past it to give a courteous response. Yes, I'm okay," said my mouth, totally opposite to my head. He set me in the back seat while he climbed in front. I sat up slowly and got a view of the compound as we drove away, and as I saw the result of this all, my mind cleared up. 1,000 uncontainable thoughts condensed into one question. How many gunshots did you create? I said through the silence previously broken only by his hyperventilation. He stopped crying after a few moments, and then, once the silence had had its time, he replied, "It was a war, son. The gunshots were made for me. I just gave them a home." As we drove through the forest, I couldn't help but wonder one last thing. The question of my mother's status in life or death now took over my mind as I accepted what the officer had just said, but I already knew the answer that really mattered. Even if she was dead physically, even if this war was the end of my battle for the parallel and against the ordinance of the Overseer, her memory would never leave, and in a way, that's even more powerful. If I had gotten closure, seen her die truly, then I would know my fate, but the uncertainty surrounding that gave her an entirely new habitat. Now, she was a memory that would haunt me forever, a possible threat that I would forever fear, an adversary that would forever be at war with my livelihood, and, above all else, a mother that I would forever have been alienated from. In the end, that's really what I'll struggle against. The end. Before I close this audiobook off, I'd like to give a huge shout out to One Big Boy Critic and S.L. Pravil for producing and helping with the making of this book. And I'd like to give a thank you to everyone listening to this, everyone who read the book. I hope you liked it. If you did, then make sure to check out other videos of mine, other upcoming Creed Universe projects of mine. If you want me to write another book, I think you'll be happy to know that I will be writing a sequel to Parallel, a story of two universes, at some point. That's right. Be safe, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and goodbye. Thank you all.